LaShonda Jones told the court that she plays videos just to listen to her son's voice and told Cuellar he does not deserve to walk the earth. Cuellar burst into tears.
I want to apologize to the family again, sincerely. I was a fool for just taking her words and not really looking to see who he was. It was stupid.
Kemia Hassel called 911, screaming that someone had just shot her husband in their driveway. Officers arrived to find a 23-year-old Army sergeant bleeding out next to his truck, still breathing, keys still in his pocket. It looked like a robbery, then like mistaken identity. Then the license plate readers started talking, and what investigators found wasn't a random killer. It was a conspiracy that had been planned for months across state lines, involving someone who was standing at the crime scene pretending to grieve. The immediate response centered on stabilizing the victim and securing the scene. Kemia Hassel, who had placed the emergency call, was visibly distressed. Their 1-year-old son remained inside the residence during the incident. Officers conducted a protective sweep to ensure the child's safety and to rule out additional threats within the home. Family members and neighbors began arriving within minutes, drawn by the commotion in what was typically a quiet residential area. During the initial assessment, investigators documented the physical evidence present at the scene. Multiple shell casings were recovered from the driveway, scattered near where the victim had fallen. Blood patterns were visible on the truck and across the pavement. Bullet damage to the garage structure indicated the shooter's positioning. Critically, officers noted that Sergeant Hassel still had his money, phone, and car keys in his possession. His vehicle remained in the driveway, undisturbed. Based on these preliminary observations, the investigative team initially considered two primary theories. The first was that this represented a robbery attempt that had escalated into violence. However, the presence of valuables on the victim's person complicated this interpretation. The second theory centered on mistaken identity, that the shooter had intended to target someone else in the household or neighborhood and struck the wrong individual in error. The timeline established during initial interviews placed Sergeant Hassel returning to the residence just after 11:01 p.m. According to his wife's statement, he had stepped outside after bringing food into the home. Moments later, she heard gunshots coming from the area near the driveway. When she ran outside, she discovered her husband lying next to his truck, critically wounded. With no immediate suspect identification and no clear motive established at the scene, investigators faced an open question. Was this a random act of violence, a targeted attack on the wrong person, or something else entirely? As investigators processed the driveway scene in greater detail, the physical evidence began to narrow the scope of their working theories. The configuration of shell casings, blood spatter patterns, and bullet trajectory provided critical information about the nature of the attack. Officers recovered multiple 9mm shell casings concentrated in a specific area of the driveway, suggesting the shooter had maintained a relatively fixed position during the incident. The casing's placement, combined with bullet holes found in the garage structure, indicated the shooter had been positioned behind the victim while Sergeant Hassel stood near the doorway of his truck. The ballistic evidence presented a clear picture of intentionality. The victim had sustained gunshot wounds specifically to the head, face, neck, and shoulders, a pattern inconsistent with a panicked or chaotic exchange. The clustering of these injuries, combined with the close-range nature of the shooting evident from brick matter at the scene, suggested a deliberate and focused attack rather than random violence or warning shots that had escalated. The robbery theory, initially considered viable given the late-night timing and residential setting, collapsed under scrutiny of what remained on the victim's person. Sergeant Hassel's wallet containing money, his cell phone, and his vehicle keys were all recovered at the scene. The pickup truck itself showed no signs of attempted entry or tampering. No other items appeared to have been taken from the victim or the immediate area. This constellation of facts made it highly improbable that theft had been the motive. Investigators also noted the absence of signs suggesting a struggle or confrontation. The victim's positioning and the evidence pattern indicated he had been ambushed rather than engaged in any form of altercation prior to the shooting. The shooter appeared to have waited for Sergeant Hassel to exit the residence and approach his vehicle before opening fire. The forensic documentation extended to the surrounding area. Officers secured potential exit routes and canvassed for witnesses who might have observed vehicles or individuals in the vicinity around the time of the shooting. The residential location, while quiet, was not isolated. Nearby homes had sight lines to the driveway area. By the conclusion of the initial scene processing, investigators had effectively eliminated robbery as a credible motive. The evidence instead pointed toward a targeted attack on Sergeant Hassel specifically. The question shifted from whether this was random violence to identifying who would have reason to target a young military service member home on leave. The sequence of events on New Year's Eve followed a pattern that investigators would later recognize as deliberately orchestrated. Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III was spending the holiday at his father's residence, accompanied by his wife Kemia and their 1-year-old son. Earlier that evening, he had made a trip to Walmart, where surveillance footage captured him purchasing 9mm ammunition. The footage also showed him encountering 2 other individuals in the store, an interaction that would initially draw investigative attention before being ruled irrelevant. Sergeant Hassel returned to the residence at approximately 11 p.m. According to the initial statements provided to responding officers, he had brought food back to the home for his wife and child. After entering the residence and delivering the food, he stepped back outside. The stated reason for this second exit remained unclear during the initial investigation, though the presence of his vehicle keys suggested he may have been preparing to leave again or retrieve something from his truck. Within moments of Sergeant Hassel exiting the residence, gunshots were heard. Kemia Hassel reported hearing the shots from inside the home where she was sitting on the couch with their son. Her immediate response, according to her account, was to move the child to a separate room before going outside to investigate. She discovered her husband lying next to his pickup truck in the driveway, suffering from multiple gunshot wounds and heavy bleeding. The 911 call was placed immediately following this discovery. The timestamp of the emergency call and the response time of arriving officers would later become relevant in establishing the precise window during which the shooting occurred. Dispatch received the call reporting a shooting victim at the Colfax Avenue address. Kemia Hassel's voice on the recorded call reflected clear distress as she provided location information and described finding her husband outside. First responders arrived to find Sergeant Hassel still breathing despite critical injuries. Paramedics began working to stabilize him, while officers secured the scene and began preliminary documentation. The victim was transported from the scene, but the severity of his wounds proved fatal. Sergeant Hassel died from his injuries. The timeline from Sergeant Hassel's return to the residence to the emergency response encompassed less than an hour. The compressed time frame, combined with the specific nature of the attack, would later support conclusions about premeditation and coordination between multiple parties. In the immediate aftermath of the shooting, investigators worked to reconstruct Sergeant Hassel's movements during the hours preceding his death. One of the earliest actionable leads emerged from information that he had visited a Walmart location on the night of the murder. This detail prompted detectives to prioritize obtaining surveillance footage from the store, as it represented one of the victim's last known activities before returning home. The Walmart security system captured Sergeant Hassel's presence in the store, including his movements through different sections and his transaction at the checkout. The footage confirmed that he had purchased 9mm ammunition during this visit. This fact immediately drew investigative scrutiny for multiple reasons. First, the caliber matched the shell casings recovered at the crime scene, creating a potential connection between the victim's own purchase and the weapon used against him. Second, the timing of an ammunition purchase on the same night as a fatal shooting raised questions about whether Sergeant Hassel had anticipated a threat or felt the need for self-defense preparation. The surveillance review also revealed that Sergeant Hassel had not been alone during his time in the store. The footage clearly showed him interacting with 2 other individuals while inside the Walmart. These interactions appeared casual rather than confrontational, but given the circumstances, any contact Sergeant Hassel had in the hours before his death warranted investigation. Detectives extracted still images from the footage showing these individuals and began working to identify them. The vehicle operated by these 2 individuals was also captured on Walmart's exterior cameras. Investigators documented the make, model, and other identifying characteristics of this vehicle for potential follow-up. The question became whether these encounters at Walmart represented coincidental meetings with acquaintances or if they held relevance to the subsequent shooting. Detectives returned to Tyrone Hassel Jr.'s residence approximately 15 hours after the shooting, arriving around 3:30 p.m. the following day. They presented screenshots from the Walmart surveillance footage to the victim's father, hoping he might recognize the individuals his son had encountered. The image quality made definitive identification challenging, but investigators sought any potential leads about who these people were and what relationship, if any, they had with Sergeant Hassel. The ammunition purchase and the Walmart encounters represented the first concrete investigative threads that extended beyond the immediate crime scene. Whether these elements would prove central to solving the case or merely coincidental remained to be determined through systematic follow-up. The investigative process required methodical examination of each potential lead, regardless of how promising or unlikely it appeared initially. The two individuals Sergeant Hassel had encountered at Walmart became subjects of immediate attention. Detectives worked to identify these persons through various means, including showing the surveillance images to family members and cross-referencing vehicle information captured on camera. The follow-up investigation revealed that these two men were high school friends of Sergeant Hassel with no apparent connection to criminal activity or motive for harm. Interviews with these individuals confirmed they had simply run into Sergeant Hassel by chance at the store. Their accounts were corroborated through additional witness statements and timeline verification, effectively eliminating them as persons of interest. A separate investigative thread emerged when Tyrone Hassel Jr. approached police with his own theory about the shooting. He had been reviewing social media posts and came to suspect that the intended target might have been his stepson rather than Sergeant Hassel. The stepson was reportedly involved in ongoing conflicts with other individuals, raising the possibility that the shooting represented a case of mistaken identity. Given that both young men lived at the same address, this theory had surface plausibility that required thorough examination. Detectives conducted formal interviews with the stepbrother to document his recent conflicts and identify any individuals who might pose a threat to him. They then expanded their investigation to interview witnesses and associates connected to these conflicts, attempting to establish whether any of these persons had means, opportunity, or demonstrated intent to commit violence. This process consumed approximately 1 week of investigative resources as detectives pursued each connection systematically. The stepbrother theory ultimately failed to withstand scrutiny for multiple reasons. First, none of the individuals identified through the conflict investigation showed evidence of involvement in the shooting. Second, and more significantly, the physical appearance of the stepbrother differed substantially from Sergeant Hassel's appearance. The stepbrother had long dreadlocks extending to his shoulders, a distinctive characteristic that made mistaken identity highly implausible. An assailant who had positioned himself to ambush someone leaving the residence would have had clear visual confirmation of his target. The elimination of these leads, while necessary for thorough investigation, also meant that detectives remained without a viable suspect or clear motive. The case had not advanced toward resolution through these conventional investigative paths. The breakthrough would ultimately come from a different direction entirely: community observation rather than direct connections to the victim. The investigative breakthrough came not from examining Sergeant Hassel's known associates or recent activities, but from a resident's observation of unusual behavior in the neighborhood on the night of the murder. A community member came forward to report seeing a vehicle parked in an abnormal manner near the crime scene. The witness described a black four-door car that had been backed into the driveway of a vacant residence listed for sale. This detail proved significant because backing into a driveway, particularly at a vacant property, suggested deliberate positioning for quick departure rather than a typical parking choice. The witness provided additional context that enhanced the credibility and relevance of this observation. According to their account, the vehicle had initially appeared in the area between 9:30 and 10 p.m., then departed before returning approximately 15 to 20 minutes later. On the second arrival, the driver was traveling at an estimated speed of 50 miles per hour in a residential area, an excessive rate that indicated urgency or agitation. Upon returning, the driver turned off the vehicle's lights and backed into the vacant property's driveway, where the car remained for a period of time. The witness observed the driver exit the vehicle, re-enter briefly, then exit again and walk in the direction of the Hassel residence. This behavioral pattern aligned with surveillance or pre-positioning for an ambush. The timing of the observation, occurring in the hours before the shooting, transformed what might have been dismissed as unusual parking into potential evidence of premeditation. Detectives recognized that identifying this vehicle and its operator could represent the most direct path to identifying the shooter. Investigators utilized license plate reader technology to track vehicle movements through the area. These automated systems, positioned at various points including toll booths and traffic intersections, capture and log license plate data along with timestamps and location information. By cross-referencing the description of the black four-door vehicle with license plate reader hits from the relevant time frame, detectives were able to identify a specific vehicle that had traveled through Illinois toll booths on routes consistent with travel to and from the crime scene location. The license plate registration check revealed that the vehicle belonged to an individual serving in the United States military. More specifically, the registered owner was a member of the same military battalion as Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III. The name attached to the registration was Jeremy Cuellar, identified as serving in the same squad as the victim. This connection transformed the investigation from pursuing external threats to examining relationships within Sergeant Hassel's immediate military circle. The identification of Jeremy Cuellar as the registered owner of the vehicle observed near the crime scene created jurisdictional complexities that required coordination between civilian law enforcement and military authorities. Both Cuellar and Sergeant Hassel were active duty service members stationed at Fort Stewart, placing aspects of the investigation within the purview of military justice protocols. Detectives immediately contacted investigators with the U.S. Army's Criminal Investigation Division stationed at Fort Stewart to establish a cooperative investigative framework. The military investigative apparatus provided access to personnel records, unit assignments, and institutional knowledge about relationships within the platoon that would have been difficult for civilian investigators to obtain independently. Army investigators began conducting interviews with service members connected to both Sergeant Hassel and Jeremy Cuellar, working to map social dynamics and identify any known conflicts or significant relationships that might be relevant to the homicide investigation. One interview subject proved particularly valuable to the investigation's progress. Sergeant Bacon, a member of the same military unit, possessed direct personal knowledge of both Jeremy Cuellar and Kemia Hassel. During his interview with Army investigators, Sergeant Bacon disclosed information about a relationship between these two individuals that had occurred while the unit was stationed in Korea. According to his account, Cuellar and Kemia Hassel had been messing around, a term he clarified to mean sexually involved, during their Korea deployment. This relationship had occurred while Kemia was married to Sergeant Hassel. The Korea relationship disclosure fundamentally altered the investigative trajectory. What had initially appeared as a potential conflict between military colleagues now revealed a more complex dynamic involving romantic entanglement. The existence of this prior relationship provided a potential motive framework that had been absent from previous investigative theories. It also elevated Kemia Hassel from her status as grieving widow and primary witness to a person whose background relationships required scrutiny. The interagency coordination allowed investigators to develop a more complete picture before conducting formal interrogations of the primary suspects. Military investigators continued gathering information from platoon members about the nature and duration of the Korea relationship, whether it had continued after the unit's return to the United States, and whether Sergeant Hassel had been aware of his wife's involvement with Cuellar. Civilian law enforcement and Army investigators coordinated the timing of their respective interviews with Jeremy Cuellar and Kemia Hassel to ensure neither suspect would have opportunity to communicate with the other once questioning began. This synchronized approach reflected standard investigative practice when multiple suspects might coordinate their accounts if given warning that authorities had identified them both as persons of interest in the homicide. The coordinated interviews with Kemia Hassel and Jeremy Cuellar were conducted simultaneously to prevent any opportunity for communication or coordination between the two suspects. This tactical approach proved critical, as the outcomes of these separate interrogations diverged significantly in both substance and legal implications. Jeremy Cuellar's interview, conducted by Army investigators in Georgia in coordination with civilian law enforcement, concluded almost immediately after it began. Upon being advised of his constitutional rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to legal representation, Cuellar invoked his right to counsel. This invocation required investigators to terminate the interview without obtaining any statement regarding his involvement in the homicide, his relationship with Kemia Hassel, or his presence in Michigan on the night of the shooting. His exercise of Fifth Amendment protections meant that the case against him would need to be built entirely on physical evidence and witness testimony rather than any admission or explanation from Cuellar himself. The interview with Kemia Hassel followed a dramatically different trajectory. Unlike Cuellar, she did not invoke her right to silence or request legal representation. Over the course of the interrogation, she provided investigators with detailed admissions about her involvement in planning her husband's murder. According to her statement, the conspiracy had originated while the unit was stationed in Korea, where she and Jeremy Cuellar had developed their romantic relationship. Kemia Hassel described conversations with Cuellar in which she had expressed dissatisfaction with her marriage and a desire to end the relationship. She stated that when she mentioned her husband would be unlikely to agree to divorce, Cuellar had responded that he could handle that and would get that guy. She acknowledged that these conversations progressed from abstract discussion to concrete planning, with coordination continuing after their return to the United States. The interrogation documentation captured her account of the operational planning that preceded the murder. She described providing Cuellar with real-time information about her husband's location and activities on the day of the shooting. Specifically, she stated that she had communicated to Cuellar that Sergeant Hassel was returning to bring food to the residence, providing the timing necessary for Cuellar to position himself for the ambush. She confirmed that she was aware of Cuellar's presence and intent on the night her husband was killed. Based on the confession obtained from Kemia Hassel, the physical evidence placing Cuellar's vehicle at the scene, and the witness testimony establishing their prior relationship, prosecutors determined they had sufficient basis for charges. Kemia Hassel was arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder, reflecting the planned nature of the conspiracy and her active role in facilitating the killing. The legal proceedings following the arrest moved through the criminal justice system over the course of several months, culminating in separate resolutions for the two defendants. Jeremy Cuellar entered a guilty plea to second-degree murder on July 30th, 2019. This charge, while serious, reflected a reduction from first-degree premeditated murder, likely resulting from plea negotiations between defense counsel and prosecutors. The distinction between first-degree and second-degree murder classifications carries significant sentencing implications, though both represent intentional homicide. Cuellar's sentencing hearing resulted in a term of 65 years in prison. The Michigan Sentencing Guidelines and Judicial Determination placed his earliest eligibility for parole consideration at age 90. Given typical life expectancy calculations, this effectively constitutes a de facto life sentence. As the statistical probability of Cuellar surviving to parole eligibility age and then being granted release approaches zero, the sentence reflected both the premeditated nature of the homicide and Cuellar's role as the individual who physically carried out the shooting. Kemia Hassel faced trial on the original charge of first-degree premeditated murder. Her confession during interrogation, combined with the evidence establishing her active participation in planning and facilitating the murder, supported the more severe charge classification. On August 29, 2019, approximately 8 months after Sergeant Hassel's death, she was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence represents the most severe punishment available under Michigan law and ensures permanent incarceration with no mechanism for release regardless of time served or rehabilitation claims. The finality of Kemia Hassel's sentence stood in contrast to Jeremy Cuellar's technically parole-eligible status, though both defendants faced practical permanence of incarceration. However, Cuellar attempted to challenge his conviction through the appellate process. He filed a motion to withdraw his guilty plea, arguing grounds that would justify setting aside his conviction and potentially proceeding to trial. The specific legal arguments raised in this motion are not detailed in the available record, but such motions typically allege ineffective assistance of counsel, procedural irregularities, or claims that the plea was not entered knowingly and voluntarily. The appellate process progressed through Michigan's court system, ultimately reaching the state's highest judicial authority. In 2021, the Michigan Supreme Court declined to hear Cuellar's case, effectively affirming the lower court decisions that had denied his motion to withdraw the plea. This refusal to grant review exhausted his direct appellate options within the state court system, cementing the validity of his conviction and 65-year sentence. The legal proceedings formally concluded both cases, though the consequences for the families involved remain permanent and irreversible.